Do you know if it's being recorded already?
He has to hit the button. It is. You got to come here. So I'm going to tell himself.
Okay. You're right. We'll probably be using that. But. It's not working. Does he have to turn on the mic?
Hugh, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Derek Knopfler. I'm the Strategic Development Manager at Pomerleau here in Ottawa. We got a slight twist in our plans for this afternoon. Unfortunately, Hugh had some travel complications, and we're going to be doing things via Zoom today. So, on behalf of the OCA and us as sponsors, I'm very happy to introduce the Artificial Intelligence in Construction, Friend or Foe. And today's speaker, as I mentioned, is Hugh Seaton, CEO of The Link. Take it away, Hugh. Oh, before you start, Hugh, if anybody has questions, because we're doing this via Zoom, please come up to the camera or to the microphone in the front. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for making this happen. Again, my apologies that we had some issues. So today I want to walk you through artificial intelligence sort of from the ground up. Like a lot of words, artificial intelligence and AI more generally has been used in almost mythical terms. Like we just throw it around without really knowing quite what we're talking about. So I'm going to start with some definitions. The very first one is what you'd expect. What is artificial intelligence? So, to begin with, hang on, there we go. We see this all the time, right? When you're talking about AI, you're seeing shiny robots, you're seeing, things that look like humans. And the reason why I like to say this is because I find that very distracting. Anchoring your thinking on AI being something to compare against human thinking leads to all sorts of the wrong assumptions, especially when people are using more modern AI like ChatGPT and so on, where we ask it questions as if we weren't talking to a piece of software, which absolutely is what we are. And that's what I'd like to introduce to you right now. Is we think about what AI is. The first thing to remember is we are talking about software. Excuse me. On the right-hand side, this is actually kind of a schematic of what a deep neural network looks like, a very simple one, but it gives you an idea of kind of what we're talking about. So the first point is AI is software. It is not a simulacrum, it is not a simulated human, it is not a digital brain. What is different about it is that without explicit programming, it can do things. Every other bit of software, and I'll differentiate kind of classic software with AI. Classic software, everything that you want to have done, whether it's pressing a button and a thing happens, whether it's recognizing something, adding up, whatever it is, all of that had a line of code that made it happen. You can point to the line or lines of code. In contrast, it's a lot harder to do with AI because we've trained it with lots and lots of data. And as a result, it can do things that you don't have to say, think about facial recognition or voice recognition, how hard it would be if you had to line by line write how to recognize me or anyone in the room right now. It's impossible. We know this because we couldn't do it before AI, despite having tried an awful lot. And the interesting thing is that really allows us to do unique things. The reason we are here is because AI is software that you can get to do things without explicitly programming, and it'll do things you couldn't otherwise get done. Easy examples of that are, I mentioned a moment ago, facial recognition or machine vision generally is just leagues ahead of where it was when we didn't have deep learning to do it. And AI obviously is the superset of deep learning. Similarly, voice recognition. Prior to AI, we had things like Dragon. For some of you in the audience may remember that product from like 20 years ago. And it was clunky, it barely worked. You had to maybe train it on your voice, and heaven forbid there was any other noise, and it just stopped working. Whereas one of the interesting things about AI is it's very often quite robust to how messy the world really is. Whereas classic software is pretty brittle. As soon as something changes, it stops working. What falls out of that is another point I'd like to make, is at the end of the day, AI is math. It's not magic. So, again, I often hear people talking about AI, in semi-mythical terms, or it's going to take over. I mean, just people get a little wound up because they think it is more than it is. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm spending my life and dedicating, well, certainly a lot of my life, to the commercialization and development of AI. So clearly, I think something important is happening. But I do want us to put it in the right perspective so that you can think about it clearly as opposed to, not. So now that we've got a working definition, AI is software that can do things without explicit programming that are unique. The next thing to keep in mind is the way it does that is through probabilities. So you may have seen this if you've seen like imagery of machine vision and so on, where they'll put the box around things. You may or may not have seen this, which is the percentage that it thinks it's recognizing something. So it knows this is a person with 92% confidence. It thinks that's a handbag with way less confidence. That's really important because under the hood, lots of the AI that you're using is actually delivering a probability. You just don't see it because the user interface says, okay, above a threshold, let's assume that it's real. And as you can see, over 90% is pretty good. That's an important point that we'll get to in a moment, is what level of accuracy is good enough. The handbag, clearly we're comfortable being a little bit less accurate with, whereas the human, the people anyway, are probably the main thing that's being tracked. This is in comparison to normal or classic software, where again, there's a line of code for everything that gets done, or some set of lines of code. It's deterministic. In other words, you press a button, that thing is going to happen. Not I hope something's going to happen, not something likely to happen. The thing you programmed is going to happen. With AI, there is variability, and as a result, there's risk. So as we think about all the cool things AI can do, it's worth keeping in mind that it's just software and that it is doing things on a probabilistic basis. When I tell you that, suddenly the idea of bias in AI makes a lot more sense. We never heard about bias, at least not very much, heard about bias when it came to classic software, because again, if it had a bug, it had a bug, that's fine. But because AI is taking data and doing math against it, if the data that you used has bias, has some incompleteness, you're going to find that it produces probabilities that are not what you want. And we're going to get to a fun example of that in just a moment. So the key point I want you to walk away from, though, is as we're adopting more and more AI, and more importantly, more and more sophisticated AI, there can be a temptation to use AI for literally everything. And actually, as someone who builds software for a living, I can tell you there's a lot of things that intuitively you might think AI is a better idea, but actually classic software can do a better job, usually more reliably and definitely more cheaply. So AI is not taking over all of software. It is empowering certain things, it's allowing for certain capabilities. But if you want to go through, like I spend a lot of time with construction specifications, if we want to go through and pull all examples of something, let's say a lead credit or something, AI is not a great way to do that. There's other things, for those of you who know software, regex is a good enough way to do that. And I know it's going to work every time. So a key point here is AI does some pretty amazing things, but it's not magic, and there are moments where classic software is a better idea. So you'll find real folks making software usually will say, if I can get it done with classic software, I'm going to do that and save the AI for things that only AI can do, like writing or creating things or summarizing and so on. So I'm going to take a sec. We've now covered actually a fair bit. We now know what that AI is just software, it's math, probabilities versus deterministic software. But now I'm going to make it even more complicated and say there are two kinds of AI out there that are in the market right now, and they behave differently. So it's not just telling you a difference without a distinction without a difference. It really matters, actually. From the left-hand side is deep learning. That's what actually some of you guys may know this, University of Toronto in 2011, they started really making deep learning work and revolutionized AI. Prior to that, it had kind of gone sleepy. One of the reasons why University of Toronto still has kind of an amazing program. Coming out of this, though, it's a version of machine learning. Machine learning can be everything from statistics all the way up to deep learning and so on. To do this, though, you need a ton of labeled data. This is why you've been hearing things for the last X number of years about, data is the new oil and blah, blah, blah. It can do some pretty crazy things. It can classify things. And what's important about that is it can recognize and classify things in the real world, even when the lighting is different or they're turned, or things you just couldn't do with classic software. And that's really changed a lot of different bits of software and technology, where we can now talk to our phones in a way you just could not before, where machine vision does things that you just couldn't do before. Really has created a lot of value and a lot of interesting applications. In contrast, much more recently is generative AI. This is the ChatGPTs, the large language models, and so on. A couple things are different at the kind of product level. One of them is there's a different algorithm. So it's a thing called the transformer. We don't need to get into what that is, but if you're curious, Google it. No pun intended, because it came from Google. So they actually do things a little different. It is also hundreds of thousands of times larger than a deep learning model. So an example is 100 million parameters was really big for a deep learning model, whereas a trillion is kind of state-of-the-art, not even state-of-the-art, for generative AI. So again, you're talking about many, many zeros larger. This is where you get pretty amazing stuff, though, where it can write, doesn't just recognize, it can actually create things. That's the name generative AI. So why does this distinction matter? So deep learning's been around for, as I mentioned, over a decade. It had a little bit of hype, and then it sort of died down because what we found was most companies, and certainly most users, had nowhere near enough data to create their own product or their own models. So you typically were powered by something else, usually from a Google or an AWS or universities sometimes. The risk here, so again, I want to be clear about both what it can do, but the risk to be careful about. And in the case of deep learning, the biggest risk typically is data quality, quantity, and bias. Quality matters because everyone here is in the building industry. A lot of our data isn't particularly clean. It wasn't created or stored to be fed into a model. So quality is a big deal. And actually, typically when you're building a model, the 90% of the process is cleaning up and organizing your data, and then you go through the rest of it. Quantity is a big one because you need to have a lot of the same data to feed in so you can start to create that model. And bias relates to the other two. And frankly, very often when I hear people talking about bias, they're including in one class of bias that is very important, but it's not the whole story, where they're talking about people or ethnicities or various other sampling of humans. Totally valid, but it's worth noting that that actually covers more than that. Like, let's say you wanted to make a model that can recognize tools, but you only had drills and you didn't have, I don't know, some other thing. The point I'm making is it's only going to be as good as the data that you've given it and the data you've given it enough quantity of. So an example of that is, a lot of folks thought in 2017, 2018 that by around 2019, 2020, we would have full self-driving cars. Well, the reason we don't is because of this. Despite billions of dollars, many billions of dollars, and literally billions of LiDAR spins, which is one of the ways they describe kind of data quantity, it still doesn't work out in the wild because there's so much information, there's so many examples and so many instances out there that are really hard to cover. The world is loaded with edge cases and rarely occurring events. In contrast, Generative AI is much newer. It's getting a lot of hype, and that hype is really sticking because now actual people can use it. Folks that are not an AI engineer or not, drawing it from a Google API. What's important to note also, though, is that the key input for most people isn't actually data. That's being handled on the back end by the OpenAIs of the world. The key input, and this is why I think this is very relevant, generative AI is really relevant to the building industry. You're able to give it knowledge and it can do things. Knowledge in the form typically of a document, but not only, it can also look at, it has to do some transformation, but it can look at videos and actually now getting to the point where it can watch people and learn. That's really amazing because in an industry that's got what is likely to be a chronic labor shortage, lots of folks retiring out, being able to capture some of that knowledge and make it useful to people. Now we have a tool and a direction that is being developed pretty aggressively. The difference here, as I mentioned, is users are directly interacting with it. The big risk that most people that are thinking about this will talk about is because the outputs of generative AI are so good, they're so well organized, they're so well formatted, we treat it like a human and we tend to trust it before it's ready. In the US, as you might have heard, we on occasion sue people. Well, it turns, I'm saying that facetiously, there were 2 instances where a lawyer used ChatGPT to write closing arguments. And in both cases, opposing counsel actually took the trouble to look those cases up, the citations. And they were both fake. And in one case, someone was fined, and the other, the person was disbarred. But the reason why that's important for you to understand is a trained lawyer looked at what came out of ChatGPT and said, well, this looks legit. Obviously, that person was, should have checked, of course. But my point here is it looked so good that he or she didn't think to do that. And the point here is that most of the cues that we look for competence are present here. Competence, usually if something's well formatted, it's well, all the words that are used are a little more advanced and it's fluent, we tend to think this person sounds like they know what they're doing. Well, in the case of AI, it sounds like that even when it has no idea what it's doing. So some of the cues that we look to will be misleading, and that is a big risk. So as we think about, that's sort of on the product side. The other thing, though, is what are the challenges for users? So to get the most, or you can get a good response from ChatGPT, or we have a product called SpecGPT, you're getting to a place now where you really want to ask questions better than we're used to. So there's a habit in the world now to basically do Google queries, and I find most people that are using generative AI right now are treating it like it's Google, when actually there's a reason they called it a chatbot. You get to be iterative. You get to ask a series of questions, and actually the cool thing is they'll build on the question. It remembers what you said. If it's in the same stream, you can re-up it. But if you keep the questions in the stream, it's remembering its questions and answers before, and using those to, and I apologize, using those questions and answers to give you a better answer the next round. So that's kind of point one. Is I'd love for all or most of you to walk away from this talk saying, I'm going to go Google how to prompt, if you haven't already. It's not as complicated as it might sound. They threw this word prompt engineering, probably because someone wanted to get paid more. But most of the time, you're not actually engineering anything. You're just thinking about how you might ask a question. And an analogy I like to use is imagine you've got an intern with zero background in the learning industry, but is very industrious and very resourceful. How would you ask that person to get something done? That's a good model in your mind for how a good prompt would be. You want to say, who's this for? What's the context? What do I want as an output? So expanding your question a little bit will give you better answers and honestly much faster ones. The second point here, some of you may have heard about, I actually just gave an example of what amounted to a hallucination where it came up with citations that were inaccurate. This is less of an issue than it was, but again, because of the probabilistic nature of AI, there's always going to be a risk that what you've been given needs to be double-checked. In contrast, deep learning, I mentioned before that the challenge is very much always going to be data. Is the data, do you have enough of it? Is it covering everything that you're covering? And it's important that you have somewhere to start, and the first thing always to think about is how accurate do I need this to be? And that matters because if you need it to be very accurate, it's entirely possible you won't have enough data. On the other hand, if you can have it to be at 80% accuracy, and that's just augmenting you or helping you or whatever the use case may be, it's a lot easier to get done. We get to a place where, this chart here, it's kind of wonky looking, but basically it's saying the more accurate, as your accuracy goes up, your data requirements at first are pretty modest. But as you get closer to 80, 90, 90+%, it becomes close to vertical. This is a version of this chart is what I saw in 2018 when one of the folks who really does data for a living, a guy named Alexander Wong, was talking about self-driving cars. And when it was not cool to do so, he said, there's no way we're getting self-driving cars before 2025, 2026. It was remarkably accurate. And the point he was making is, in the beginning, you can get, if your accuracy levels are low, it's pretty doable. But when you need to get really accurate into the 90, 95%, suddenly it gets to be really, really hard. And if, heaven forbid, you need 99.99%, it's just almost impossible. The number of, again, the amount of money that's been spent to try to crack this nut shows how hard it is. And this is one of the reasons why, as you're being pitched things, keep in mind that product demos are a hothouse, right? They've controlled a bunch of variables, so things that work well when you've controlled all those variables, it may not when you put it out into the real world. Of course, that's what pilots are for. But I think this is one of the points also when people say, I've seen something shown to me, this is going to be the implication for the future. So futurists, bless their hearts, love to do that. But the reality is the world is super messy, and of course, the building industry is the definition of complex and messy. So things that work really well, again, in a limited instance, often don't in the real world. So that gets you to another idea that I'd love for you to consider. In the professional services world, it's really common to say you can have quality, you can have time, or you can have cost. You get two of them, right? So that's a good analogy for this, in that you've got a trade-off for AI. And this is actually true for any kind of AI, whether it's generative or deep learning. You can have it be really accurate, or a small problem, or a ton of data. So if you have less data, you're going to have to put up with less accuracy, or a smaller problem. Now, the thing that is usually in the control of folks like you and me is to make the problem smaller. We typically don't get a choice about how accurate something needs to be because it's whatever the use case is that usually dictates it. And data is either cost or just availability. So often what you can do is ask a smaller problem. Back to the idea of prompts, one of the things I see people do very often is go to a ChatGPT or a SpecGPT and ask a question that a human would struggle to answer, but also it's too big, as opposed to breaking the problem apart. I'm not going to get into to prompt kind of techniques, but a lot of them do that. A lot of them will tell you if you've got a problem and it's not performing, it's not giving you the answer you want, break the problem into pieces and ask the AI to do them one at a time. So make the problem smaller is practically a bumper sticker in my life. So this has, of course, also shaped the impact on the landscape. So as I mentioned before, AI is usually from some big company's product like Siri or Google or whatever. In-house use cases have been really limited to companies that tend to have vast amounts of clean data. That usually is folks that have a lot of transactions. So it's financial services, i.e. banks and so on, retail, logistics. Really hard for construction and real estate. We just don't have that much data that you can line up next to each other. Even if the data is clean, as everyone is quick to tell you, different projects are different, have a lot of different factors. So I'm kind of marching through this because I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A, so bear with me. All of that to say, AI doesn't fail like a human would. I mentioned before that some of the cues that we're used to are not valid with AI. So it's important for you to keep in mind that your intuition about how people work, some of you may have heard of the term theory of mind. It is how you are able to have conversations with other people and not talk over each other. You have a model of what's going on in the other person's mind, and you use that to interact with them successfully, usually. The problem is that leads us astray with AI, because the cues we're looking for are often misleading. That was not really true with deep learning. It's super true with generative AI, and going to become more so as we start to have voice and other modalities that come out of generative AI. It's going to be really hard for us to keep in mind and not, Anthropomorphizing has been around since people were making pet rocks. We just naturally think of things as being either human or certainly animate, and it's important that we avoid that and keep in mind that the results that come from AI do not emerge the way they do in humans. Our brains are fundamentally different, despite the words like neural and all that other stuff. Specifically, it's a top-down versus a bottom-up. Our brains are made in a very top-down way. We have a model of the world that we walk around and we compare data to it. In contrast, AI takes data and then ladders up from there. So it's going to make its decisions based on huge volumes of data. So I mentioned before I was going to give you an example of what I meant. In 2017, researchers built an image recognizer of dog breeds. Very common, actually, because there's some amazing data. In fact, dog breeds are what Professor Hinton and the folks at University of Toronto used in 2011. Anyway, this one was confusing huskies with wolves. Now, here's where top-down versus bottom-up happens. A human would top-down and say, well, they look alike. So our model of the world, we would begin to create hypotheses because they do, right? A husky and a wolf, certainly more than a husky and a basset hound, right? Those of you who know basset hound really know what I'm talking about. In contrast, the reason AI was getting it wrong is because the data included both huskies and wolves with pictures with snow behind them. So it was lumping things together because there was a bias in the data. My point earlier about how it's important to think about bias more broadly than the human bias we're so used to thinking about. And this is a weird one, like no one would have said, hey, let's double check and make sure all the backgrounds have variation, but it turned out to be a problem. This again brings us back to why human in the loop is important, because you're going to catch things. You're going to have a top-down view of how the world should be, and otherwise known as a sniff test. So this is an example where they actually looked at the model and were trying to figure out what it was using, and it turned out, as I say, to be the background. So the key takeaway here, always have a human in the loop. There is no AI that is ready to be left entirely alone. For the reasons I just mentioned, there's no voice in the back of its head, saying, hey, this doesn't smell right, because it doesn't have that top-down view yet. Absolutely, people are working on it, but it'll be a while before that's ready, and certainly before you trust it. So back to our distinction between the two, deep learning and generative AI. The reason I keep making this distinction is because, again, they behave differently and they do different things, and they require different things. In the case of deep learning, it's turning data into information. So that photo is a dog, or this email is spam. So usually it's classifying and telling you something that's going on in the world. In contrast, generative AI, like ChatGPT, turns knowledge into wisdom. So it'll survey things, it'll summarize pre-existing content, it'll take knowledge and compare it against other knowledge. You're going to find that documents are one of the areas increasingly where some pretty amazing products are created, and some of the things you like least about your job are going to be automated or semi-automated because generative AI is able to do some pretty amazing things. I like to say it'll enable better decisions, and it'll make decisions, but those will be pretty minor, like how to go find information and so on. So a key takeaway from all of this is deep learning just requires enormous amounts of clean data. Generative AI can use knowledge, think about company guides, think about quality bulletins, think about interviews and blog content. It's kind of amazing how much data is actually out there. Let me rephrase it. How much information is out there that isn't necessarily formatted as data. Suddenly we're able to do things with it, which is pretty amazing. As we think about going from a time of labor scarcity and retirement, the ability to actually manage knowledge and apply it this is an amazing tool to help us with that. It isn't a good tool on its own. It will be a good tool when it has product wrapped around it, because you're going to need a bunch of things. So just using ChatGPT or things that are off the shelf tends to be interesting, but not really kind of ready for prime time. But you're seeing more and more of this, and I think over the coming 2-3 years, you're going to see some pretty amazing stuff. Right, so now that we've kind of defined what AI is, and we understand that there are at least 2 flavors of it, and some of why one and the other are have different risks and different requirements, let's talk a little bit about how this is going to change project delivery. So the first thing, for those of you who may be paying attention to the space, it's already moving really fast. 2023 was breathtaking at what happened. We went from ChatGPT to GPT-4 to GPT. I mean, they've got it's hysterical. Every 2 weeks there's another one. There's stuff coming out of France. There's stuff coming out of Meta. Blah blah blah. What's coming next, though, and this has already been there's already been things released, but I think you're going to hear in the back half of the year more and more about this. Is the idea of an agent. So what chatbots can do is give you an answer or a series of answers, but it's kind of answer and response. In contrast, the point of an agent is to go a step further and set a goal. And it will be the agent's job to figure out how to succeed, whether it's writing a report or doing some research. It will be tasked with figuring out where to go look for things or what to do and how to transform them. So you're kind of going a level up from where ChatGPT and the chatbots are now. This is super exciting because, again, think about it as an intern who's a genius with 0 people skills. So you're still going to have to give it a lot of input, a lot of context. But what's also interesting is that they're getting better and better at learning what you want, whether it's you as a person or you as a company. So you're going to need to give it less and less of this over time. But an intern for me is a very helpful intuition because you're talking about a cognitive agent who's highly capable in certain areas, but does not bring the experience, the judgment, the intuition that somebody who's been at this for a long time has. So you're able to get it to do things as long as it doesn't require your judgment. It's going to need your supervision, just like an intern might. And when you think about how this will matter, think about all of the documents you wish you could pay someone to check. All the times when the drawing doesn't quite match the specs, or the specs include information that maybe got a little old because it's a 2-year project and you might want to double check that warranty, or just there's a lot of paperwork that is supposed to agree with itself that frequently doesn't until there's a problem or we find out later. But what if you could automate that? What if you could have every night all of your documents get checked against each other, or checked against the building code, or checked, you name it. Things that you've never paid a human to do, you can now think about doing. This is just one idea, but you're going to find that sort of thing where, everything from, hang on, get to that in a sec. Of things that you wish you had some, project coordinators or folks straight out of school that could do, you just would never pay them to do it. We've seen this sort of thing in other industries in the past because of labor fluctuations. I think this is going to be a big deal in the coming 5 years. Our relationship to documents, data, and document risk, I think, will change pretty significantly. So when you think about some of what I've mentioned before, what can generative AI actually do? So the first one that I like to say is no more blank sheets of paper. So whether it's writing an email, writing an RFI, whether it's writing a response or various other things, you can now have AI jumpstart the process. And in so doing, increase your output, increase your ability to get things done quickly. I don't know about you, but the third email in a row, it starts to get a little bit hard to write. So being able to have drafts created quickly is pretty cool. And I think you're going to find that we're better and better able to automate things like the filling out of forms or the responses so that you're editing, you're not creating. And it takes an awful lot less time to edit than it does to create from scratch. Similarly, tedious searching and summarizing. So, one of the points I'm going to get to in a minute is this going to take everyone's job? No. But what it will do is take away some of the tasks that are often huge time wasters, like, searching the specs. That's obviously where I live and breathe, but RFIs and change orders, or the communications, what email said what did it mean? And lessons learned was what I was talking about before. Another way you can see it helping is speeding up job analysis. So extracting plans, extracting spec information early in the job, during the job, going back and finding things, summarizing it in a table on demand. One of the cool things that you don't hear about enough is actually generative AI can very often make a website for you or a table, or it's not just giving you the answer spit out. You can often ask for it the way you want. And what you're going to find is that increasingly people allow you to create your own tables and your own different ways of accessing and working with the information that it's got for you. Then, this is sort of an obvious one now, but avoiding guessing about terms or requirements. 6 months into a job, it's very often that people forget a term or a requirement. You ought to be able to just ask the question and find that. That is our bread and butter, but Anyway, you're just going to find that that's no longer the question. A little bit like, paper maps are like specs, are like printed specs, right? Like they're a pain in the neck to read, they're long, they're difficult, and you only really use them when it's a disaster or you're lost. Well, in this case, imagine if maps were like Google Maps, where, if you're even a little unsure, you pull it out and go check. That's how our access to data and documents needs to be. So I think, and kind of the thesis of today, is that AI will completely change the economics of project delivery and of the industry as a whole. How it's going to do that is what we're going to discover together. There's no crystal ball here. It's going to be up to you as members of the industry, as well as folks like me that are creating products, to figure out what's the right balance between preserving how people do things now that over the years you've worked out, how am I going to get this done at a level of risk I'm comfortable with, versus how am I going to do new things and achieve higher efficiency, lower risk, and so on and so forth. When we talk about economics, the question you hear so frequently is AI coming for your job? And I think the answer is, look, if you look at AI from a product standpoint and it could maybe do this standpoint, you arrive at pretty bad answers because there's a lot of potential. Remember I said before, the amount of data you need to do certain things is enormous. Now think about how often you're able to solve problems you've never seen before. Much of what's going on in a professional's life is way to the right of that chart where I showed how the data required is actually quite significant. So what that means is the left side, where you don't need so much data because it's easier or it's more constrained, is where you're going to see AI make much more progress. The best way I've ever heard to think about this, again from the University of Toronto, there's an economist named Jay Agrawal. He's not the only one that wrote this book, but it's a book called Prediction Machines I encourage you to check out. Agrawal and some others I forgot. Basically, he said, what if we look at AI as an economic input? Rather than getting all jazzed up about the technology and what it might do someday out in the future, what's it doing now? And his point is, it's replacing, in the case of deep learning, it's replacing the ability to recognize and manage certain things. But the broader point he makes, and this is classic economics, is when you reduce the cost of an input, in some cases almost to zero, things that that do similar things lose value. In contrast, if you are a complement to it, in other words, it's a tool that you use, your value will often go up. And the analogy I hear people use that I really like is the ATM. So most people in the audience don't remember when ATMs first became prevalent. I sadly do. And it turns out that at the time, everyone was concerned that ATMs were going to put bank branches and bank tellers out of business. But what they really did was take away the lowest value thing that a bank teller does, which is dispense cash. And while they were doing it, a lot of them were able to charge fees that they never could have charged before. So Bank of America would never be able to charge fees to a non-Bank of America customer, or Chase or whoever. But now they were able to do that. So suddenly they were making money from people that weren't even their customers. But since they pulled that away, they were making a lot more money in a totally new revenue source. But also they allowed bank tellers to do more high value things like sell mutual funds or various other, or deal. What they do a lot of is with small business. Suddenly they were able to add more value, and it turned out that there were more bank branches and bank tellers than there were before the ATM. That's, for me, a really great example of this economic point. So as you think about our industry, there are things that we do that are clearly low value, and it'd be great if AI could take some of that burden away. In the short run, that is what I think the story is going to be. In the longer run, the tech is moving fast enough that I don't know where we're going to be. But within the time frame that we care about, it's worth keeping in mind that this is the story you're most likely to see. I like to say within the next 5 years, the skilled trade expertise is not getting automated away. Judgment, that is why you have a job, is not being automated away. And experience is not being automated away. Even if we're able to take everyone's experience, interview, and kind of write down pieces of paper, who knows if that's even a third or a tenth of what makes you valuable as a professional. Like the things that you can write down and codify, it's not without value for sure, but it's nowhere near the whole story. So I think that you're going to find more and more things become automated, things that you don't like doing. You're going to find yourself an editor more than a writer if you so choose. If you really like writing, Godspeed. When you hear people say this catchphrase, AI isn't going to replace you, someone using AI is going to replace you, this is what we mean. Because if you can imagine, back to this story, if you're using AI, this new input, your value rises because the higher value parts of what you're able to do become more of your day. And the BS, flipping through a spec book to find a thing, then spending 2 hours to go look for something is no longer going to be an issue. So for me, that's a good story. I mean, at the end of the day, the jury's out on what happens in 10 years, but 5 years I feel good about. The other question though, and interestingly, this is also from the same set of authors that wrote another book, I think I have cited it, I do, Power and Predictions, the next one. Their point is, the microeconomic story is what I mentioned a moment ago, is that your job will be impacted by the degree to which you use these tools. The bigger question is what's going to happen to the industry? And very often people use electricity as their analogy, and they'll say, AI is the new electricity. Great, well, let's look at electricity. It turns out it took something like 50 years to get fully adopted. And the reason for that is what happens in the beginning. Everyone's heard the term point solution. In the beginning, what happened with electricity is they went into factories. That's the analogy they used the most, the story they used the most. Factories used to be one big stinky steam engine. It was really loud, it was really dangerous, and they had belts that would run all of the parts of the factory that needed power. Well, the first thing that they tried to do was say, hey, this thing is really dangerous, let's replace it with an electric engine. Sometimes that worked, there was a little bit of uptick, but really it wasn't enough better. So people, again, it made a little progress. The next thing they did, because the technology of electric engines got better, is they started putting engines where all of the little stations were, so you didn't need the belts anymore. Again, much better, much easier, probably some productivity gains. But what really changed is when they said, why do we have all these machines in a circle? Let's put them into a straight line. Now all of a sudden, it fundamentally changed how an industry did what it did, and it changed the way the world makes things with the assembly line. So the point in all of this is when real change comes, when we rethink how we do things at a more fundamental level than where are we putting pieces of paper and where is the data coming and going. This is the unknowable. What is going to change in our industry? What will be unlocked by AI in the same way that the electric engine unlocked the ability to be productive and efficient? I think that's going to be documents, but we'll see. So guys, we've got a couple minutes left. I want to take a detour and talk a little bit about the process side of this. So when we talk about software, one of the key things is it's helping us to manage complexity and complicatedness, those two aren't the same, by abstracting away details so that we can focus. When I say abstraction, it's a term you've heard before. We use it in maps all the time. When our question is where do we park, we look at this level. When our question is what exit do we take from a highway, we look at this level. What highway do we take? We look at this level. So when you think about that, that's the sort of thing that we need to be talking to ourselves more about, is how are we asking questions of our software? So I hopped over here, I apologize, but I want to make sure I get this in. That the future is not just going to be who's using the best products and AI and so on. It's how are we training our people to use this stuff in new ways? That's where that industry transformation is really going to happen. I think abstraction is a key concept that we should be using more because it really relates to how software and AI work. And I think that if there's a takeaway, it would be that, is how are we going to be thinking about the use of these tools in new ways and new processes. So kind of a takeaway there is AI-driven process change is going to create more change than any specific product will. We saw that really in every industry. Some of you may be familiar with something called the Solo's paradox. So in 1980, in the 80s, excuse me, there was another economist who said, hey, we've been investing in IT for over 30 years, basically from the 50s onward. Why don't I see this in my productivity metrics? And the point was the process had not changed yet. The 90s were a really big period of process change. You had all sorts of stuff like key competence of the corporation and SAP and all this other stuff. And ultimately the point is the real gains come when we do our jobs differently, not when we have a better tool. So coming in for a landing, and summarizing some of what we said before. So what you need to know. The first one is keep in mind that AI is just software. As it continues to do pretty amazing stuff, keep in mind that it is coming from a different place from where humans are. Deep learning and generative AI are different, so you're going to require different things. I encourage you all to think about knowledge, especially documentary knowledge, when you're thinking about generative AI. There's just loads of it in our industry, and this is an opportunity for us to make it useful in a way that it wasn't before. Key risk is trusting AI before it's ready. So just always keep thinking, you know, are we trusting this too much? Do we have checks and balances? Do we have an editor? Do we have somebody supervising it? Always have a human in the loop, certainly within the next 5 years. Prompting is critical, so I encourage you to whether you do it personally or get someone on your team, to figure out prompting. This is happily not the most complicated thing in the world. They use terms like prompt engineering because they want to get paid more. But the truth is most of this is just stuff, it's basically briefing an intern as if they don't know your background at all. So it's really not that hard, and there's a ton of great YouTube videos about it. You're going to find that AI is going to drive process changes, not just giving you new tools. I think the productivity gains could be enormous. There are economists, a little more broadly than construction, who are talking about this potentially being one of those once-in-a-century things. But also, the key thing here is every time we take another step up the technology ladder, one of the points is we're better able to manage complexity, better able to manage risk, and also, you know, I think this could wind up being really important. So as you think about, so I want to show you, I want to end with something amazing. Have any of you, raise your hands if you've heard of Sora from OpenAI. Has anyone heard of this? We got 2, 3 out there. So I'm not going to, this is like a 10-minute video. Hopefully it'll play. But basically, you guys can see this?
Yeah.
So it's basically from just that little phrase. Hang on a minute. I'm going to go back to it. Yeah, just this little prompt, it created this out of nowhere. This drove people crazy because the quality is absolutely 4K, and it came out of nowhere. It can only do a minute as of when they launched it. But they've gone, I encourage you to go on YouTube and look for Sora, just S-O-R-A. There's a bunch of examples there. Here's another fun one where somebody said, I want a bunch of, red foxes running over Petri dishes. There's tons of these, and they're really amazing. The reason I bring this up is it's an illustration of how this industry and this set of technologies continues to get better and better and do things that are truly surprising. But I've been talking about risks and limits today, so I want to do that as well. Just because it did something in a pretty kind of contrived, not contrived, but in a limited example, doesn't mean that you suddenly are not going to have, the Toronto film industry, right? Like a lot of creative decisions were taken out of people's hands here. So to make this into a useful tool, there's an awful lot of work left to do. Although I hear Adobe, not surprisingly, is working on it. So that is, I'm going to leave that there. You guys, I encourage you to check it out if you have time. The broader point that I'll leave you with is I've been in technology one way or the other for 30 years, and nothing has ever moved even close to this fast. I was there with broadband. I was there with the first round of AI. Nothing is even close to this. So I'm excited you're in sessions like this, and I encourage you to check out other things as well. And to that point, here are the final things I'll say is avoid the hype. Construction is still hard. There are no AI silver bullets coming. Have someone in your team where you personally really learn how to write prompts. I mentioned earlier. I do AI in construction webinars once a month. You can see them on LinkedIn, or you can go to YouTube and just look for my name. But most of my videos are that. But also, make sure you get out there and try this. So, ChatGPT is $20 a month, something like that. We have a product called SpecGPT, which you can by all means check it out. A little more than that because it's tuned for specs, but the broad point is there are pretty low-cost ways of getting to know this and starting to build your own judgment and intuition. That's it. I hope we got 13 minutes for question and answer. I want to thank you all for paying attention to a talking head on the Zoom box.
Thanks so much, Hugh. So just open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions, just come on up to the microphone. Don't be shy. It was that good that we don't have any questions? John, you must have a question. Put you on the spot.
I got a question.
Oh, okay.
So my question is concerning security and putting all this information to ChatGPT or SpecGPT and the risk involved with that.
That's a great question, and it is probably the most construction question you could have led with. So there's a couple things I'd say. Security, first of all, these are cloud products. So a lot of the same methods and ways that we keep things secure in the cloud are true here, whether it's encrypted back and forth and so on. The other thing is, as of like March of last year, actually kind of forever, OpenAI and the other providers of models do not take your data for training. They used to do that with ChatGPT if it was the open consumer version, but when you're using this in a product because you paid for an API, they will not expose it. So it's only being used in a kind of consumption way, if that makes sense. So your data is not going to wind up training some model and showing up somewhere else. Like that's not done anymore. So hopefully that answers the security question.
How about the application of AI to streamlining building codes?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
How about the use of AI for streamlining building codes? Because we have so many contradictions internally with respect to building code.
Guys, I don't know what's wrong with the mic. I just am having trouble hearing it.
Should I try it without the mic? Can you hear me without the mic?
Check. Can you hear me, Hugh?
Bizarre. My apologies. It's just hard to understand.
So the question, I'm not sure if you can hear me, Hugh, but is around building code. No?
Can you hear it, Hugh?
Is there any maybe feedback? I don't know what just happened.
No.
Just try one more time. I'm so sorry.
The application of AI to building code and streamlining building codes.
I'm so sorry. I can't understand it. It's got this weird feedback. Is there another mic by any chance?
We
He's picking up the sound grid of that thing when that turned on.
More slowly.
Typing in the chat. Typing in the chat.
Can
John,
you hear-
would
can
somebody
you hear
maybe
me
just
now?
type it into the chat?
Can you hear it now? Whoever's got a computer at the back, can you type it?
That computer.
try that.
Okay, in relation to the building code alignment. But, well, while you maybe type the second half of that, there's a few things. One is, ICC in the US actually has an AI kind of front end that allows you to check different codes. It's a paid service, of course it is. But I think you're finding that AI is actually quite good at that. Extending it out into different, kind of aligning different things to building codes will depend a little on what you mean. But there's already some work being done there. We're certainly looking at that as well. Like, how does the spec relate to the building code and so on? Hopefully that answers your question. The building code is one of those things that actually AI is really good at.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hugh.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Do I dare ask? Anybody else have another question, just in case? Okay.
Well, I encourage you guys to do kind of what I was saying is go check this out yourselves. As I say, I've got once a month I do a free webinar and I put it up on. You can find it on LinkedIn when it's live, but the recordings are always up. So thank you all for your time, and again, I apologize for the clunkiness of some of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hugh, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. Don't forget, we've got the feature presentation coming up in the main room, followed by the cocktail reception.